They said a woman like her would never rise again, especially not with 2 kids and no one standing beside her. But they didn't see what silence was hiding. The morning air carried the faint smell of burnt coffee and damp asphalt as Emily Carter stood outside the elementary school, her fingers wrapped tightly around the straps of her worn leather bag, watching her twins disappear into a sea of bright backpacks and louder lies that didn't belong to them, whispers trailing behind them like shadows. That's her, the single mom, poor kids, and she heard every word, felt each one land like a quiet echo in her chest. But her face didn't change, not a flicker, not a crack, just that same calm, almost distant expression that made people assume she had already accepted her place in the world, small, overlooked, forgotten. But what they didn't notice was the way her eyes moved, sharp, measuring, the way her phone buzzed once in her hand, and she silenced it without looking, because somewhere across the city, 42 floors above ground in a glass tower that caught the early sunlight like a blade, a room full of executives sat waiting there. Polished shoes lined under a long marble table, their voices low, tense, because a deal worth over $200 million couldn't move forward without a single approval. A name they spoke carefully, almost cautiously, initials only, EC. While back on the sidewalk, Emily adjusted her coat, thin fabric brushing against her wrists as a cold breeze slipped through, and for a moment she closed her eyes, not in defeat, but in control, as if timing something no one else could see. A black SUV rolled past slowly, unnoticed by the parents rushing to their cars, unnoticed by the teachers calling out reminders, but the driver's eyes flicked toward her, waiting, always waiting, and across town, a man straightened his tie in a mirrored conference room. Daniel Brooks, confident, composed, rehearsing the pitch that would save his company. The same man who once looked at Emily and saw something disposable, something replaceable, something he could walk away from without consequence. And now he stood on the edge of something much larger than himself, unaware that every number, every clause, every second of his future rested in the hands of the woman he no longer recognized, because to him, Emily Carter was still just a quiet single mother with 2 kids and no power. And as she turned away from the school and stepped into the morning light, her phone lit up again, a single message this time, simple, direct, "They're ready for you." And for the first time, the faintest hint of a smile touched her lips, not warm, not soft, but certain, because the world had already made its judgment, and she was about to let it be wrong. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and Emily stepped inside without hesitation, her reflection briefly catching in the brushed steel walls, a woman most people would pass without a second glance. Yet the moment the doors closed, the world shifted in ways no one outside could see, because while she pressed the button for the 42nd floor, the building itself seemed to recognize her, security systems unlocking without a badge, cameras adjusting, a silent acknowledgement woven into the architecture, and upstairs the tension tightened, voices lowering as a senior executive checked his watch for the 3rd time, whispering, "She is late," only for another to respond carefully, "No, she arrives exactly when she means to," while across the long marble table, Daniel Brooks adjusted his cufflinks, impatience flickering beneath his polished confidence, his presentation ready, his numbers precise, his future hanging on approval from someone he had never met, someone reduced to 2 initials in an email chain, someone he assumed was just another distant investor behind layers of wealth and anonymity. And yet something about the room unsettled him, the way no one relaxed, the way even the most powerful men sat a little straighter, as if waiting for a presence that did not need to announce itself. And down below, the elevator climbed steadily, each floor passing with quiet certainty. Emily's phone lighting up again with updates she barely needed to read. Market shifts. Signatures pending, a subtle change in currency exchange that had already been accounted for hours ago. Because this was not reaction, this was design, years of quiet control built from a place no one thought to look back when she had been standing in smaller rooms, hearing smaller opinions, learning who underestimated her and why, and choosing not to correct them, because invisibility had become her advantage, not her weakness. And as the elevator reached the final floor, she exhaled slowly. Not from nerves, but from timing, like a conductor preparing the downbeat of a performance no one realized they were part of. And when the doors slid open, the hallway stretched ahead in polished stone and glass, the city skyline spilling through floor-to-ceiling windows, sunlight catching the edges of everything, turning it into something sharper, clearer, undeniable. And one by one, assistants stood aside without a word, doors opening before she reached them, a path forming not out of courtesy, but recognition. And inside the boardroom, a silence fell that was heavier than any announcement, because the door had not yet opened, but they all felt it, the shift, the arrival, the moment something unseen became unavoidable. And Daniel, for reasons he could not explain, found himself straightening his posture, his rehearsed confidence slipping just enough to notice, as the handle turned slowly, and the woman he would never have looked twice had stepped into the room, not introduced, not announced, but known. And in that instant, the distance between who he thought she was and who she actually was began to collapse, though he did not yet understand how far it would fall. No one spoke when she entered, not because they were told to remain silent, but because something in a room instinctively shifted, as if the air itself understood what Daniel Brooks did not yet see. Emily Carter walked forward with measured steps, the soft sound of her shoes against polished stone echoing more clearly than any voice. And one by one, every executive at the table rose to their feet, not dramatically, not hurriedly, but with a quiet, deliberate respect that felt practiced, expected, inevitable. And Daniel felt it then, a subtle fracture in his certainty, because this was not how meetings began, not for him, not for anyone, yet no one questioned it. No one hesitated as Emily reached the head of the table and took her seat without asking, without acknowledging the gesture, as though the space had always belonged to her, and only then did the room settle again, chairs sliding back into place, hands folding, eyes lowering just enough to signal something deeper than politeness, something closer to recognition. And Daniel cleared his throat, forcing a smile that felt tighter than it should, his presentation ready, his voice steady as he began outlining projections, growth curves, acquisition strategies, everything he believed would secure the approval he needed. But as he spoke, he could not ignore the stillness at the far end of the table, the way Emily listened without interruption, without expression, her gaze steady, unblinking, absorbing every word as though she had already heard it before, as though she had already decided. And when he finished, there was a brief pause, a silence that stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable. And then she spoke, her voice calm, even, carrying across the room without effort. Your numbers assume a margin shift in the third quarter, and Daniel blinked, caught off guard, because that detail had not been highlighted, not publicly, not in the summary he had distributed. Yet she continued, precise, unhurried, a shift that would only occur if the overseas supplier agreement was renegotiated 2 weeks ago. And now the room was no longer still, but attentive in a different way, eyes moving between them, because that agreement had not been announced. It had been signed quietly, strategically, and Daniel felt something colder settle beneath his composure, because there was only one way she could know that, only one position from which that information made sense. And he tried to recover, to redirect, to regain control of the narrative he had walked in with. But the ground had already moved beneath him, and Emily leaned back slightly, not in arrogance, not in challenge, but in certainty, her fingers resting lightly against the table as she regarded him with the same calm detachment she had worn outside the school that morning. And then she said it, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a clarity that left no room for interpretation. You asked for approval, a pause, just enough for the weight of the words to settle. You are speaking to the one who grants it. And in that moment, the room did not react with shock or surprise, because for them, this was not a revelation. It was confirmation, but for Daniel, it was the unraveling of everything he thought. He understood, the quiet single mother he had once dismissed, now sitting at the center of a world he could not enter without her permission. And as the silence returned, deeper this time, heavier, undeniable. He finally saw her, not as she had been, but as she was, and realized far too late that she had never needed to prove anything at all. The silence did not break. It deepened, settling over the room like a weight no one dared to shift. And Daniel Brooks felt it press against his chest as every assumption he had carried into that boardroom quietly collapsed. Because this was not a negotiation anymore. This was exposure. And across from him, Emily Carter remained exactly as she had been outside the school that morning. Composed, still. Her presence neither aggressive nor defensive, just absolute. And that was what made it impossible to challenge, because power that needed to prove itself could be questioned. But this did not ask for validation. It simply existed. And as the second stretched, one of the senior executives leaned forward slightly, his voice measured, almost careful. Miss Carter has reviewed all projections prior to this meeting, a statement that was not meant to inform Daniel, but to anchor the room in something already understood. And Daniel nodded slowly, forcing his posture back into place, attempting to reclaim some fragment of control. Then I believe you can see the long-term value this partnership offers, he said, his tone steadier now, though the edge of uncertainty lingered beneath it. And Emily watched him for a moment longer, not evaluating his numbers, not reconsidering his proposal, but observing him as if measuring something less tangible, something that could not be presented on a slide or summarized in a report. And when she finally spoke again, her voice carried the same quiet clarity. Value is not only what is projected, it is what is proven. And the words landed without force, yet no one in the room missed their meaning, because they were not about the deal, not entirely. They were about him, about history, about decisions made long before this moment. And Daniel felt it, the shift from business to something far more personal, though no one else acknowledged it openly. Because in this room, everything remained professional, even when it was not. And Emily's gaze did not waver as she continued. Your company has potential, a pause, deliberate, controlled, but potential is not the same as reliability. And there it was, the final separation, the quiet line drawn between what he wanted and what she would allow. And Daniel opened his mouth to respond, to argue, to reframe, but the words did not come as easily now, because for the first time he was not speaking from a place of advantage. He was asking, and she was deciding. And Emily turned slightly, not away from him, but toward the window, where the city stretched endlessly beneath them, sunlight reflecting off glass and steel, a world that once felt distant to her, now resting entirely within her reach. And without raising her voice, without adding emphasis, she concluded, "We will not be moving forward." And the sentence did not echo, did not need to, because its finality settled. Instantly, unmistakably, and around the table. No one reacted with surprise, only acknowledgement. Documents were closed, screens dimmed, decisions accepted as though they had always been inevitable. And Daniel sat there, still, absorbing the outcome that had slipped beyond his control before he even understood the rules of the room. And as Emily stood, gathering nothing, taking nothing with her but the quiet authority she had brought in, she allowed herself one brief glance in his direction. Not triumphant, not bitter, just certain. And in that moment, he realized the truth he had missed all along, that she had never been waiting for an opportunity to rise. She had already risen, and he had simply been too blind to see where he was standing. The door closed behind her with a soft, final click, and the sound lingered longer than it should have, as if the room itself needed a moment to recover from her absence. Because even after Emily Carter left, the weight of her decision remained, settled into every surface, every document, every unspoken thought. And Daniel Brooks sat motionless for a beat too long, his hands still resting on the edge of the table, his reflection faint in the polished marble as the reality of what had just happened began to fully take shape, not as a sudden shock, but as a slow, undeniable understanding, because this was not just a rejected deal, it was a recalibration of everything he believed about control, about power, about her. And across the table, the executives had already shifted into quiet efficiency, gathering papers, exchanging brief, low-voiced remarks, none of them questioning the outcome, none of them revisiting the discussion, Because in this room, her word was not debated, it was accepted, and that acceptance, that effortless alignment, cut deeper than any confrontation ever could, and Daniel pushed his chair back slightly, the subtle scrape against the floor sounding louder than he intended, drawing a few brief glances that quickly returned to their tasks, because to them, he was no longer the center of the room, not anymore. And as he stood, straightening his jacket out of habit more than necessity, he felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not anger, not embarrassment, but something quieter, heavier, something closer to recognition, because for the first time, he could not rewrite the narrative in his favor, could not reinterpret what had just unfolded into something manageable. And as he stepped out into the hallway, the same polished corridor that had once seemed like a pathway to opportunity now felt different, longer, more distant. And at the far end, he caught a glimpse of her, already moving toward the elevator, her pace unhurried, her posture unchanged, as if nothing extraordinary had occurred, as if this had been just another morning in a life built far beyond his reach. And without thinking, he called out, not loudly, not with authority, but with something uncertain threaded into his voice. Emily. The name felt unfamiliar on his tongue, as though it belonged to a version of her that no longer existed, and she paused, not immediately, but after a breath, turning just enough to acknowledge him, her expression calm, unreadable, and for a moment, the distance between them stretched, filled with everything that had been said and everything that had not. And Daniel took a step closer, searching for something, a reaction, a crack, any sign that the woman before him was still the one he once believed he knew. But there was nothing, only that same quiet certainty, and he exhaled slowly, the words he had prepared dissolving before they could form, replaced instead by a simple truth he could no longer ignore. "I did not know," he said, and it was not an excuse, not a justification, just a statement, raw and unpolished. And Emily regarded him for a moment longer, her gaze steady, not unkind, but not softened either. And when she spoke, her voice carried the same calm clarity that had filled the boardroom. "You never asked," and the sentence did not accuse, did not linger. It simply existed, complete and unchangeable. And with that, she turned back toward the elevator, the doors opening as if they had been waiting for her all along. And as she stepped inside, the space seemed to close around her world once more, leaving Daniel standing alone in a hallway that suddenly felt far too quiet, realizing that the woman he had once overlooked had never needed to prove her worth, only to live it. And now, for the first time, he understood that what he had lost was not just a deal, but something far greater, something he had never taken the time to see. The elevator doors closed with a quiet precision that mirrored everything about her, sealing Emily Carter inside a space that felt entirely her own, insulated from the noise, the assumptions, the past that no longer had any claim on her present. And as the numbers descended slowly, floor by floor, she allowed herself a single breath that was deeper than the rest, not out of relief, but out of completion. Because what had just happened upstairs was not a victory she needed to celebrate. It was simply the continuation of a life she had built piece by piece, decision by decision, long before anyone thought to look for her at the top. And her reflection in the mirror panel did not change, still the same understated coat, the same quiet expression, the same woman people passed without noticing. Yet now the contrast felt almost deliberate, like a choice she had made and continued to make every single day, to remain unseen until being seen mattered. And as the elevator reached the lobby, the doors opened to a different rhythm of movement, reception staff straightening subtly, conversations lowering, a path forming without instruction. And outside, the black SUV waited exactly where it had been that morning, the driver stepping forward not with urgency, but with certainty, opening the door as she approached. And she paused for a fraction of a second, her gaze lifting toward the skyline, the glass tower behind her reflecting sunlight in sharp, clean lines, a place where power spoke in numbers and signatures. Yet none of it followed her because she did not carry it, she embodied it. And as she stepped into the car, The city shifted again, from towering structures to passing streets, from boardrooms to sidewalks, from decisions worth millions to the quiet hum of everyday life. And across town, the elementary school bell rang, children spilling out in bursts of laughter and small chaos, backpacks bouncing, voices overlapping, and, among them, her twins waited near the curb, scanning the crowd with a familiarity that came from knowing exactly who they were looking for. And when the SUV pulled up, it did not draw attention the way luxury often did. Not because it was hidden, but because no one expected it to belong to her. And Emily stepped out just as she had that morning. Same coat, same calm presence, as if nothing had changed. And her children ran toward her, their energy bright, unfiltered, cutting through everything else. And she knelt slightly, meeting them at their level, her hands resting gently on their shoulders, her expression softening in a way no boardroom would ever see. And for a moment, the world narrowed to just that, their voices, their laughter, the simple exchange of a day that mattered to them more than anything else. And as they climbed into the car, one of them glanced back toward the school, where a few parents stood watching, confusion flickering across their faces as they tried to reconcile what they were seeing with what they believed. And Emily followed her child's gaze briefly, not with pride, not with defiance, but with a quiet understanding, because she had never needed to correct them, never needed to explain. The truth did not require permission to exist. And as the door closed and the car pulled away, she settled back in her seat, her phone lighting up once more with new updates, new decisions waiting. A world still turning under her guidance, but her focus shifted instead to the soft voices beside her, to the small details that mattered in ways no contract ever could. And somewhere in the distance, far behind them now, a man stood in a building of glass and steel, beginning to understand that the woman he once overlooked had never been small, only silent, and that silence had been her greatest strength all along. That night, long after the city lights softened into a quiet glow against the skyline, Daniel Brooks sat alone in his office, the glass walls around him reflecting not success, but something far more unfamiliar, something unsettled, because for the first time in years, he could not move forward with certainty, could not map out his next step with the same calculated precision that had once defined him. And the deal he had lost was only part of it, a visible consequence of something much deeper, something he had not recognized until it was already too late. And his mind replayed the moment in the boardroom again and again, not the rejection itself, but the way she had looked at him, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a calm detachment that made it clear she had already moved beyond anything he could offer. And it was that absence of emotion that stayed with him, because it meant he no longer held any place in her world, not even as a memory worth reacting to. And he stood, walking slowly toward the window, the city stretching below him in sharp lines of light and shadow, a world he had once believed he controlled. Yet now it felt different, as though something essential had shifted beyond his reach. And on his desk, his phone lit up with messages from colleagues, advisors, questions about the meeting, about the outcome, about what had gone wrong. And for once, he did not respond immediately, because the answer was not in the numbers, not in the projections, not in any of the strategies he had prepared. It was in something far simpler, something he had overlooked for years, and across the city, in a quiet home far removed from glass towers and boardrooms, Emily Carter sat at the edge of her children's beds, the soft glow of a night light casting gentle shadows across the room. Her voice low as she finished reading the last page of a story they had heard countless times, yet still listened to as if it were new. And when they drifted into sleep, their breathing steady and peaceful, she remained there for a moment longer, her hand resting lightly against the blanket, grounding herself not in the power she held, but in the life she had chosen to protect. And when she finally stood, stepping into the quiet hallway, her phone vibrated softly in her hand. Another message, another decision waiting, but she did not check it immediately. Instead, she walked to the window, looking out at the same city that had once seemed distant, unreachable, a place where she had been overlooked, underestimated, and quietly dismissed. And now it stood before her, unchanged, yet entirely different because she had changed, and she had done it without needing to prove anything to anyone, without needing to announce her rise. And as she finally glanced at the screen, the message was simple: a new acquisition opportunity, numbers already aligned, signatures ready for her approval. And she held the phone for a moment, considering not the deal itself, but the path that had led her here, the choices made in silence, the strength built in moments no one had witnessed. And with a calm, steady motion, she typed a single response, decisive, clear. And as she set the phone down, the city lights reflected in the glass before her, not as something she needed to reach for, but as something she already held, while somewhere else, a man stared out at the same skyline, beginning to understand that the power he had once taken for granted was never his to begin with, and that the woman he had overlooked had never needed to rise in his world, because she had already built one of her own. Morning arrived without announcement, slipping quietly through the curtains as pale sunlight stretched across the room, and Emily Carter was already awake, standing in the kitchen with a cup of coffee that had gone untouched, her gaze resting on the small details of the morning that most people rushed past: the hum of the refrigerator, the soft ticking of the wall clock, the distant sound of traffic beginning to build, all of it steady, predictable, grounding, and yet beneath that calm surface. Her phone lay on the counter, screen dark now, but carrying the weight of decisions that would ripple far beyond this quiet space, because overnight, the acquisition she had approved had already begun to shift the market, subtle movements at first, numbers adjusting, competitors recalculating, a quiet realignment that most would not notice until it was too late. And across town, in a different part of the city where glass towers caught the early light like mirrors, Daniel Brooks stood in his office again. But this time there was no stillness, no moment to process, because the consequences had already arrived. Reports spread across his desk, updates flashing across his screen, projections that no longer held, because the company he had been counting on, the one he believed he could secure, had been absorbed overnight into a larger structure, one he had not seen forming, one that now stood between him and any chance of recovery. And as he scanned the details, one name appeared repeatedly, not hidden, not reduced to initials anymore, but fully present, unmistakable. Emily Carter. It was no longer a question of who she was, but of how far her reach extended. And for the first time, he saw the pattern, the timing, the precision of it all, how every step had been placed before he even realized there was a path. And back in the kitchen, Emily set her cup aside as small footsteps approached, her twins entering the room with the unfiltered energy of a new day, their voices filling the space with questions, stories, small concerns that mattered entirely to them and only to them. And she turned toward them with a softness that did not diminish her strength, only revealed a different part of it, a balance that no boardroom could measure. And as she helped them prepare for school, tying laces, adjusting backpacks, listening with quiet attention, the world outside continued to shift in ways they did not yet understand, because for them, she was simply their mother, present, steady, enough. And when they stepped outside together, the morning air carried that same familiar crispness, the same routine, yet something had changed, not in her, but in how the world would begin to see her, though she had not asked for that change, had not sought it. And as they reached the school, a few parents glanced toward her, their expressions no longer just casual or dismissive, but uncertain, as if something they believed had been quietly corrected overnight. And Emily noticed it. Of course she did, but she did not respond, did not acknowledge the shift, because validation from others had never been part of her design. And as her children ran ahead, turning back to wave before disappearing into the building, she remained for a moment longer, standing in the same place she had stood before. Yet now the silence around her carried a different weight, not of judgment, but of realization. And somewhere behind glass and steel, a man stared at a name he could no longer ignore, beginning to understand that the story he thought had ended long ago had, in fact, only just begun to reveal itself. The shift did not announce itself loudly. It moved through the city in quiet currents, in altered headlines, in conversations that lowered when certain names were mentioned, And by mid-morning, the ripple Emily Carter had set in motion had become impossible to ignore because the acquisition was no longer just a strategic move. It was a signal, a recalibration of influence that reached far beyond a single company, and inside offices where decisions were usually made with confidence. There was now hesitation, a pause before action, a need to understand who was truly behind the structure that had formed almost overnight. And at the center of those questions, her name remained, no longer hidden behind initials, no longer dismissed as irrelevant, but spoken carefully, deliberately, as if saying it incorrectly might reveal how little they had known before. And across the city, Daniel Brooks sat in a meeting that felt very different from the ones he had once led, because this time he was not directing the conversation, he was responding to it. Investors asking questions he could not easily answer, partners reconsidering their positions, the foundation beneath him no longer stable, and every explanation he offered seemed incomplete, because the truth was not something he could present in a report, it was something he had lived through and failed to recognize. And as the meeting ended without resolution, he remained seated for a moment longer, the room slowly emptying around him, his reflection again faint in the glass surface of the table. But now he saw it differently, not as the image of control he once believed it to be, but as something uncertain, something still trying to understand what had already been decided without him. And outside, the city moved on, people walking, cars passing, life continuing in its usual rhythm. Yet beneath that normalcy, something had shifted permanently. And in a quieter part of town, Emily walked through a small bookstore after dropping her children at school, her fingers brushing lightly over the spines of books arranged neatly on wooden shelves, the scent of paper and ink filling the air, grounding. Familiar, a contrast to the cold precision of boardrooms and contracts. And here, no one looked at her with uncertainty or calculation. No one measured her worth against numbers or influence. She was simply another person moving through the space, and that simplicity was not something she escaped to, but something she had chosen to keep, a part of her life that remained untouched by everything else she controlled. And as she paused near a window, sunlight catching in the glass and reflecting softly across the room, her phone vibrated again. Another update, another confirmation that the structure she had built was holding, expanding, aligning exactly as intended, and she glanced at it briefly before slipping it back in her bag, because the outcome had already been decided long before the message arrived, and what remained now was not the execution of power, but the quiet continuation of it. And somewhere across the city, a man stood in a room that felt smaller than it had the day before, beginning to understand that power was not always loud, not always visible, and that the most dangerous kind was the one that did not need to announce itself, because by the time you noticed it, it had already changed everything. By late afternoon, the city no longer whispered. It adjusted, screens across trading floors refreshed with new alignments, headlines shifting tone from speculation to recognition, and in offices where Emily Carter's name had once been unknown, it was now spoken with a clarity that left no room for doubt, because the pattern had revealed itself fully, not through a single action, but through a sequence of decisions that connected with quiet precision, and those who understood power recognized it immediately, not as something newly created, but as something that had been there all along, waiting to be seen. And inside one of the tallest buildings in the financial district, Daniel Brooks stood in front of a floor-to-ceiling window, his phone in his hand, unread messages stacking faster than he could process them, each one a variation of the same question, the same realization. And for once, he did not respond, because there was nothing left to clarify, nothing left to negotiate. The outcome had already settled into place beyond his reach, and he exhaled slowly, the glass cool beneath his fingertips as he leaned forward slightly, looking down at the movement below, people crossing streets, cars weaving through traffic, a world that continued without pause, indifferent to the shift that had just redefined his position within it. And for the first time, he allowed himself to trace it back, not to the meeting, not to the deal, but further to the moments he had dismissed, the decisions he had made without looking closely, the assumptions that had felt so certain at the time, and each One now appeared differently, not as isolated choices, but as steps that had led him here, to this exact point, and across the city, in a quieter corner where the pace of life moved with a different rhythm. Emily walked out of the bookstore with a small paper bag in her hand, the late sunlight casting a warm glow across the sidewalk. And for a moment, she paused, adjusting the bag against her arm, her gaze lifting toward the sky, the light softening as the day began to settle into evening. And her phone remained silent now. Not because there was nothing left to decide, but because everything that mattered had already been set in motion, and what remained was simply the unfolding of it, steady, controlled, inevitable. And as she reached the curb, the familiar black SUV pulled up once again, the door opening with the same quiet certainty as before, and she stepped inside without hesitation, her reflection briefly catching in the tinted glass. Unchanged, composed, untouched by the noise surrounding her name. And as the car moved through the city, passing the very streets where she had once walked unnoticed, the contrast did not feel like a transformation, but a continuation, because she had never become someone new. She had only revealed what had always been there. And when the car turned onto a quieter street near the school, the environment shifted once more, from towering structures to familiar buildings, from boardrooms to the simple rhythm of children being picked up at the end of the day. And as she stepped out, her twins ran toward her again, their voices bright, their presence grounding, and she knelt slightly to meet them, her hand brushing gently through one child's hair, her expression softening in a way no headline could ever capture. And in that moment, the world that had just adjusted around her seemed distant, almost irrelevant, because this quiet connection, this simple exchange, was the only part that required her full attention. And as they walked together toward the car, a few parents watched, their expressions no longer filled with assumption, but with something else, something closer to understanding, though incomplete, because the truth of who she was could not be fully seen from the outside, only felt in the quiet certainty of her presence. And somewhere behind them, far above the streets, a man stood, in a place that no longer felt like his, realizing that the power he had chased had never been about control, but about awareness, and that the woman he once overlooked had understood that long before he ever did. The evening settled gently over the city, the sky fading into soft shades of amber and deep blue. And inside the car, the quiet hum of the engine blended with the low, cheerful voices of Emily Carter's twins in the back seat, their conversation drifting between school stories and small, important details that only mattered to them. And she listened, truly listened, her attention fully present in a way that no boardroom ever required, because here there were no calculations, no strategies, only connection. And as the car turned onto their street, lined with modest homes and familiar sidewalks, the contrast to the towering buildings downtown felt almost intentional, like a boundary she had drawn for herself, separating what she controlled from what she protected. And when they arrived, the children rushed ahead, laughter echoing lightly as they reached the front door, while Emily followed at a steady pace, her steps unhurried, her expression calm. And across the city, far above the streets that now seemed distant, Daniel Brooks remained in his office long after most had left, the lights dimmed around him. The city reflected in the glass like a second, quieter world, and for once he was not surrounded by noise or expectation, only by the steady presence of his own thoughts. And he found himself returning again to that single moment in the hallway. Her voice, clear and simple, "You never asked," and it echoed differently now, not as a statement about the past, but as a realization about everything he had overlooked, not just in her, but in the way he had moved through the world, assuming understanding without ever seeking it. And as he turned away from the window, his phone buzzed again, another update, another shift in a market that confirmed what he already knew, that the structure she had set in motion was not temporary, not reactive, but deliberate and lasting. And he set the phone down without reading further, because the details no longer changed the outcome. And in that quiet space, he allowed himself to acknowledge something he had resisted before, that her strength had never been something she gained after he left. It had always been there, present in ways he had not valued, not recognized, and now it stood before him in its full form, undeniable. And back in her home, Emily moved through the evening routine with the same steady rhythm, preparing dinner, helping with homework, small moments that built a life far removed from the scale of decisions she made during the day, and yet equally significant. Because this was where her purpose grounded itself, not in power, but in presence. And as the night deepened and the house grew quiet once more, she stood by the window again, looking out at the soft glow of streetlights, the world calm, contained, and her phone rested nearby, silent for now, but never truly still, because tomorrow would bring new decisions, new shifts, new outcomes shaped by the same quiet certainty she carried, and she did not need to anticipate them, did not need to prepare in the way others might, because she was already where she needed to be, and somewhere across the city, a man finally understood that the distance between who he thought she was and who she had become was not created overnight. It had always been there, waiting for him to notice, and now that he had, it was too vast to cross. The next morning did not arrive with urgency, but with clarity, the kind that settles quietly into the edges of everything, reshaping perception without demanding attention. And as sunlight filtered through the windows, casting soft patterns across the room, Emily Carter moved through her routine with the same steady rhythm, unchanged by the shifts unfolding beyond her walls, because for her, nothing had truly changed. Only the world had finally begun to see what had always been there. And as she prepared breakfast, the small sounds of the kitchen filled the space, the gentle clink of dishes, the low hum of the coffee machine, the quiet laughter of her twins as they talked about their day ahead. And she listened, present, grounded, her attention anchored in what mattered most. While across the city, in offices where certainty had once been unquestioned, conversations now carried a different tone, one of recalibration, of careful consideration, because influence had shifted in a way that could not be reversed. And at the center of that shift was a name that no longer required explanation, and Daniel. Brooks sat at his desk, the early light reflecting off the surface in front of him, his posture still, his expression unreadable, not because he did not feel the weight of everything that had happened, but because he was finally beginning to understand it, not as a loss, but as a lesson, one that extended far beyond a single deal or a single moment. And he reached for his phone, not to respond, not to react, but to read, to absorb, to see the full scope of what had been set in motion. And for the first time, he did not search for a way to change the outcome, because he understood now that some outcomes were never his to control. And back in the quiet space of her home, Emily knelt slightly to adjust her child's backpack, her fingers smoothing the fabric with a gentle precision, her gaze soft yet steady. And when her children stepped outside, their steps light, their voices bright, she followed, closing the door behind her with a quiet finality that marked the transition from one world to another. And as they walked toward the school, the morning air carried a different kind of stillness, not the silence of judgment, but the silence of recognition. And a few parents glanced toward her again, but this time, their expressions held something else, something closer to respect, though unspoken, because the shift they felt was not something they could fully explain, only something they could sense, and Emily acknowledged none of it, because acknowledgement had never been part of her intention. And as her children ran ahead once more, turning back with familiar smiles before disappearing into the building, she remained for a moment, standing in the same place where everything had once seemed so small, so defined by the limitations others placed upon her. And now, that same place felt unchanged, yet entirely different, because she had never needed it to change. She had only needed to see beyond it. And as she turned away, her phone vibrated softly in her hand. Another message, another decision waiting, but she did not check it immediately because she already knew what it would say, already knew the direction it pointed. And instead, she lifted her gaze once more, the city stretching beyond the horizon, vast, complex, and entirely within her reach, not because she had taken it, but because she had built her place within it, quietly, deliberately, and without ever needing to ask for permission. And somewhere else, in a room that no longer felt as certain as it once had, a man finally accepted that the woman he had overlooked had never been waiting to be seen. She had only been waiting for the world to catch up. The city did not pause to mark the moment. No headlines declared it final. No voices announced a conclusion. And yet something had settled into place with a quiet certainty that no one could undo. Because some endings do not arrive with noise, they arrive with understanding. And as the days moved forward, the shift that Emily Carter had set in motion became part of the structure itself, no longer a disruption, but a new foundation, one that others adapted to without fully realizing when it had taken hold. And in offices across the skyline, her decisions continued to ripple outward, shaping outcomes, redirecting paths, influencing futures in ways that remained largely unseen, because that was how she had always worked, not through spectacle, but through precision, not through recognition, but through results. And for those who paid attention, the pattern was unmistakable, a presence that did not need to announce itself, because it was already embedded in every outcome that mattered. And across the city, Daniel Brooks stood once more by the window that had become both familiar and foreign, the reflection staring back at him no longer carrying the same certainty it once had, but something more grounded, more aware. And as he watched the movement below, he no longer saw it as something to control, but something to understand, because the lesson he had been forced to learn was not about loss. It was about perspective, about the difference between assuming power and recognizing it. And he exhaled slowly, not in defeat, but in acceptance, because there was no path back to what he had believed before, only a path forward shaped by what he now knew. And somewhere else, in a quieter part of the city where life moved with a different rhythm, Emily walked hand in hand with her twins along a familiar sidewalk, their laughter light, their steps unburdened, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows that stretched ahead of them. And she matched their pace easily, her presence steady, her attention fully with them, because this simple moment was the center of everything she had built, not the boardrooms, not the contracts, not the influence that extended far beyond what anyone could see, but the quiet certainty of a life lived on her own terms. And as they reached the corner, her children ran ahead again, turning back with bright smiles that needed no translation, no explanation, only acknowledgement. And she returned it with a soft expression that held more meaning than any decision she had ever made in a room full of executives. And as she followed them, the world around her continued to move, unchanged on the surface, yet entirely different beneath it, because the truth of who she was no longer needed to be hidden. Yet she carried it the same way she always had, quietly, without demand, without display. And as the sun dipped lower, the lights softening into something warm and steady, the story that others had once tried to define for her faded completely, replaced not by something louder, but by something stronger, something lasting. And in that quiet, unspoken way, the final truth remained clear and undeniable, that she had never needed to seek power, never needed to prove her worth, because from the very beginning, she had already become the thing they underestimated, and by the time they finally understood it, she was already far beyond their reach.